Okay, I think we're going to get started. If people can take their seats. Thanks for coming out today to this talk. It's part of a lecture series. My name is Rayyan El-Amin. I'm a programs manager at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. And I'm also a coordinator of this lecture series, but also it's part of a research initiative around the Arab Uprisings. One of the components is this lecture series, but this is an AUB-wide initiative to look at the regional transformations from an interdisciplinary perspective and to do some research, have some conferences, and try to have a more in-depth perspective about what's going on, one that hopefully is different from all the things that are going on in terms of the Arab uprisings today. So I think today's lecture would be representative of a unique and an original perspective. I'm not sure how many people are talking about the Arab uprisings in this perspective. Today, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Rami Zurayk do this talk around the uprisings through an agrarian lens. As most of you know, and there's some fans out there, that Dr. Rami Zurayk is a professor here at AUB. We're very fortunate to have him here. He is part of the Department of Landscape Design and Ecosystem Management at the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences. He studied at the AUB, but also has a doctorate at Oxford. Rami Zurayk is also the author of Food, Farming, and Freedom, Sowing the Arab Spring. If you didn't know about this book, it's out there. You can get it at local bookstores. He has published dozens of articles and technical reports on agriculture, food, politics, the environment, and is of course, longtime activist around politics and social justice issues, along with, obviously, all the other issues that we have mentioned. We had wanted Rami Zurayk to speak earlier this year in terms of the Arab Uprisings series, but we finally got him to commit some time. He has a very busy schedule, but I think he personifies the type of perspective we're trying to represent in terms of the uprisings, one that has a critical analysis and one that has a interdisciplinary approach, which he definitely is critical and takes on all these issues together. He could have an ecological, political, and an economic analysis all weaved in seamlessly together, and I think that's what's impressive about his work. But his center of gravity, I think, and this is my perspective, I hope I'm not going too much, is his critique of the neoliberal policies and his class analysis, even though the issue of Palestine isn't far behind. So those are some of the things that I want to put out there. But lastly, what I think makes him the most qualified about doing a talk about the uprisings is that not just the relevance of his academic career, but his activism. And so Rami is one of the few academics that has managed to stay connected on the ground in terms of being involved on the ground within activities, everything from doing clinics to small farmers in South Lebanon to organizing international events in solidarity with Palestine. So, all these characteristics make Dr. Rami Zurayk an organic choice to talk about the uprising. So help me welcome Rami today.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Rayyan. I hope you won't be disappointed. That was a talk by itself. But I have to read from here because I lost my papers, and I'm lucky to have Anne Goff here, who I'd like to recognize as my co-author on many papers and research projects, among them the latest one we've had together, which is about food security in Gaza and how it's used as a tool of oppression. So Anne is here, and she's helped me as a co-author work on all of these papers, and luckily she had her computer with her, so I'll be reading from here. I have a PowerPoint presentation, but there are almost no words in it. They're just pictures for those who can easily get bored, and they're nice pictures. The first one here is the title of the talk, which you would notice is different from the one that was advertised. I wasn't sure people would come if I wrote the Arab Uprisings cookbook. You know, they would think this is a kind of Chef Rami working here, and one letter wouldn't make a difference. And underneath it, the background is, of course, bread, which has been over-discussed in the Arab Uprisings. And underneath it is my take on the slogan that has made the Arab revolutions kind of Sachi style, which was the Ashab yurid isqat al-nizam. And here what I write is Ashab yurid kazuz u croissant. And kazuz is, for those of you who can't speak Arabic or who are too young to know what kazuz is fizzy drinks, you know, Coke kind of stuff. And croissant, I think, is an Arabic word that is known by all the French. Now, you see, let me also say a couple of things as before, like that's a pre-introduction. When the uprising started, everybody called them the Arab Spring, and so did I, because I actually believed that that was going to change tremendously things, and it is, and it is changing us. And it's not necessarily this, you know, very joyful event in which everybody is happy coming together, singing Kumbaya and changing the regimes. This is not what's happening. However, social and political and economic changes are bound to happen, and our duty is to actually try to guide them and work on them in order to go in the direction that we want. You know, and by we I mean people who have a deep-seated concern about social justice and who have enough substantive knowledge to be able to actually come up with something that is tangible and that can be of use, not only general political slogans or kind of a facile analysis. So I hope that I haven't gotten into that, but it may still be rather sometimes sound facile. I call it the uprisings, people call it the revolution, others call it the spring, etc. I think uprisings, for me, after carefully studying what happened, is an okay term. There has been an uprising, there is no value judgment in that. In spring, there is a value judgment, and I'm not sure I keep with it. In revolution, there is also an outcome, and this outcome has yet to appear. We're in a process, and this process is a process of uprising. I work on food, essentially, on food issues. And whenever food is mentioned in the context of the Arab uprisings, it's usually for the purpose of attributing direct causality between the rise in world food prices that happened in 2008 and that continue to happen. And those of you who are clued onto these things will know that, or those of you who actually shop in the supermarket for that matter, you know, will know that food prices have almost doubled in the past 4 or 5 years. And that, I mean, let me put it this way, I'm thirsty. And I'm thirsty because there is no water. And I hope there is no water because the cafeteria has just increased the price from 500 to 1,000, as I hear right now. And that is what's going on everywhere where there is food being mentioned. So this direct causality, however, I don't buy. It is not the food prices. So before I go any further, I want to just put down the menu and then work a little bit around it. And my menu, and that's the last facetious thing I'll subject you to, is, you know, I'm going to start with some ingredients after the entree, and then I'll talk about what it is to be rural in an urban world. And then I talk about security, sovereignty, or full tummy, you know, which one do we want? And then how do we police the policy space around, how is it policed? Because it is actually policed around the food policy. And then I'm going to go into local cuisine a little bit, which is I'm going to talk about Tunisia and Syria and Egypt, and of course just an agrarian dimension of what goes on. And together we might at the end try to review a little bit of what's cooking for us in that huge stove that our region has become. This image from Tunisia of a protester holding bread was published widely as a proof of the relationship between food prices like bread and between the Arab uprising. But before I go any further, one thing needs to be made clear. To my mind, what brought people to the street is dictatorships. It's the rabid secret police. It is oppression. It's the absence of a social contract between citizen and state, and the breakdown of the communal moral economy, widespread corruption and crony capitalism. And these are extremely complex. I mean, if I ever wanted to put a Facebook status to the Arab uprising, it would be, it's complicated. So, however, that said, you know, food and farming remain an extremely important issue for all Arabs. The Arab countries are, as a group, the largest importers of food in the world, and cereal grains form the major part of these imports. Yet it is in these countries that wheat was first domesticated. It's here, in the Fertile Crescent. It is also in here that settled farming began, and that agriculture provided sufficient surplus to build empires and civilizations. While we contend, we is like Anne and I, that biophysical limitations to food productions are massive in here, means ecological, you know, and physical, and land type, especially with periodic and recurrent droughts that are worsened by climatic fluctuations. We believe that they do not fully explain the lamentable state of Arab food production. We propose here, I propose in this, in this talk here, to look at the agrarian roots of the Arab uprisings. And here, the use of the term agrarian comes both as a noun and as an adjective. Agrarians are those people who are directly involved in the cultivation of land for the production of food and fiber. However, they do that within the context of a rural society based on collective feelings of belonging. In this rural society, a moral economy binds farmers to one another and to the landscape. As an adjective, however, I use agrarian to describe an ideological position, as in agrarian reform, that advocates the redistribution of landed property. I have a thesis here. That's about the only big words that I have, and so the thesis that we have is that the driving forces of the Arab uprisings, or among the driving forces are a combination of external and internal factors that have resulted in the atomization of rural society, in increased unemployment, in rampant poverty, and in the creation of a disconnect between people and state, and people and land, and people and food. And this disconnect that Marx terms the metabolic rift. This state of affairs signals profound, though rarely directly expressed, dissatisfaction that accumulates and is dissipated through episodic intense reactions once a breaking point is attained, hence the uprisings. There are several corollaries to this thesis. One is that at the root of the Arab uprisings lies a profound discontent, rooted in the rapid social geographical transformation. So societies has been transformed, but the geography has also been transformed. And these transformations are associated with what I call the laissez-faire shift from rural to urban, and in the rapid economic transformation from an agriculture-based economy in the middle 20th century to service, trade, and real estate-based economies, the FIRE economies, catalyzed by oil rent. The second corollary is that the demise of the farm sector was accelerated by the accumulation of land and associated ecological resources, water, and state facilities, such as support subsidies from the state, in the hands of a few beneficiaries and cronies of the various regimes. This created a new agrarian question, and those of you who are familiar with Marxian analysis will know the agrarian. I think I'll talk about it in a little while here. And this new agrarian question is expressed, of course, on the human, but also it's expressed on the natural landscape. So for a time, this transformation, this elimination of small farms, this marginalization is not only expressed at the level of society, it's also expressed at the level of landscapes. Landscapes change when rural societies change. This agrarian question can be formulated as such. Hundreds of thousands of farm workers were uprooted from their land, or farmers became farm workers, uprooted from their lands through a process of legislated immiseration, and are working today on other people's lands in other regions, which can also be other countries. The third corollary is that the demise of the local food systems, once you break down this big landscape, you break down these local food systems, hence الشعب يريد كازوز وكرواسون, was caused by and led to the flourishing of the trade-based food regimes. The Arab countries are now uncomfortably engulfed into a global food regime where low-quality food is available cheaply and good quality food is a luxury. The fourth corollary is that successive Arab governments since decolonization have practiced a double level of rural development policies. Following the prevalent entrepreneurial practices, where two ledgers are kept for taxes, that seems to be quite common in Lebanon. One major politician of Lebanon actually admitted that his cement factory kept two ledgers in here. Following this prevalent entrepreneurial practice, states are keeping two policy ledgers, one for the public and one for real accounts. This political taqiyya confuses the issue of rural development. The problem of Arab agricultural policies is usually presented in terms of centrally planned socialist, i.e. Syria, versus free market liberal policies. The real issue is, however, the process by which these policies were developed and who do they actually benefit. A logical inference is that tangible change in the nature of the system can only be operated through radical transformations in the agrarian policies. These are, in turn, these policies, these changes, dependent on economic and social policies that remain hostage to the driving forces of the system. The ability to influence these macro policies constitutes the litmus test of the success or failure of the Arab uprisings and the conditions for transformation of popular actions from just protests to revolution. I shall focus my analysis here on these relationships, in three of the main countries that have been transformed by the uprisings: Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria. They present interesting cases with different policy tracks and different biophysical endowments. The availability of data has also been a deciding factor in this selection, just so that people who are concerned that Yemen is not in there, it's just a matter of where do you get the info to be able to talk about that. To be able to, I'm going to bore you with a bit of, but not too much, with a bit of like theoretical background to that, because any analysis of that kind, and that's pretty heavy, needs to be informed by some pre-existing theories. You need to locate yourself into a theoretical frame to be able to think systematically about what we're doing. So I won't bore you too much, but I just need to talk about them a little bit. To carry out any exploration at the nexus of food and the Arab uprising, a set of theoretical tools are required. Sarah Roy's theory of de-development, which she developed, she came up with when she was working on how the Zionist entity deals with the Palestinian. When she developed that theory, she created something, she coined something that, in my opinion, is invaluable to any study of economic sectors, as it outlines how development gains by developing nations, as well as by marginalized communities, can be systematically undermined. De-development does not apply only to the Zionist treatment of Palestine, as Sarah Roy put it. It also applies to how autocracies and compradorial classes have acted towards their own nations. And that is how we become informed by de-development theory. Political ecology is useful to bringing out the ties between politics and people's relationship with the landscape by drawing on both fields of ecology and political economy. Food regime theory states that the study of food and agriculture offers insight into the global political economy and provides an understanding of capital accumulation and the function of food and land in spatial politics. Depeasantization refers to the process of marginalizations of agrarians. The concept was developed in order to describe the mass exodus of small farmers from agricultural lands to cities in the 1980s as a direct result of structural adjustment programs imposed on poor countries by the Washington Consensus. If it is generally accepted that food is a basic human right, then people are entitled to enough food both through affordability of market goods and through right of access to those natural resources essential for food production. Amartya Sen formalized this concept as entitlement, which he conceives as a bundle of interconnected determinants. I'm not a great fan of the later Sen, but I'm actually quite okay with the earlier Sen before he was nobilized. In a recent article, McLaughlin addresses the issue of the agrarian question in the light of the limited survival of family farms. He attributes the resilience of smallholder agriculture, inter alia, to the specific nature of agriculture and the peculiarities of land as a factor of production, and to state intervention. Now that's really important because that's why some small farms, I mean there is in some parts of the US, of Canada, of Europe, small farmers are seeing some kind of a revival. But they can only do that because there is strong state intervention in very, very many different ways. Some of them might not be direct, some of them might be implicit, but they do exist. However, this state intervention is actually lacking in poorer countries. So this whole agrarian question is going to be to develop and to be evolved in a very different way. What it is like to be a rural person in an urban world, and why do I say urban world? Well, I say urban world because the Arab world is one of the most rapidly urbanizing regions of the world. Currently, 56% of the population is considered to be urban. But that's very quick, but only just about over half. So slightly below half is actually still rural. In 1980, it was 45%, which projections standing at 66% by 2020. As of 2010, the urban population of Egypt alone was about 43%, that of Tunisia, 67%, and that of Syria, 55%. However, while the total rural population is declining in percentages, in relative figures, few people know that the absolute figure for the number of rural people is increasing in most countries of the Arab world. As in the rest of the world, of course, Arab poverty is mostly rural. In Egypt, poverty levels in rural areas are at 43.7%, and recent reports have found this number increasing. Syria's rural poverty rate in 2010 was 15%. And yeah, I mean, that's like Syrian statistics. And, but what we also know is that 62% of poor people in Syria live in rural areas. So most of the poor are rural, even though they might just be 15%. Yemen has 40% rural poverty, and 80% of those that are poor live in rural area as well. In many countries, rural livelihoods are strongly diversified. This is something that's really important because a lot of people think that there are farmers who are just farmers, who live only off the farm. And this is very, very rare. In Lebanon, very few people, I think the latest census found something like only 5 or 6% of the farming community living only from agriculture. So livelihoods are strongly diversified, and agricultural income is only a small share of the total income. In this chart, you'll find, I'll read it with you quickly. This is how can I do that? Do you have like a pointer? No. Just look at it. And okay, look, let me just say what that says. It's the chart that says how diversified Okay, let's look just at the rural here, all right? Okay, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 is the poorest, 5 is the richest. Okay, 1 is the poorest, 5 is the richest. Everybody is diversified. Agriculture only provides a small part of the livelihood of people who live in rural areas. And in Syria, it provides a bigger part the poorer you are, and the smaller part the richer you are. In Egypt, it provides, this is in reverse. The richer you are, the more money you're likely to make from agriculture. And this, of course, has to do that the large landowners are very successful in Egypt. Well, land rent has not been fully liberated, and I use the term liberated here in between quotes in the same way as we talk about neoliberalism, for example. The land rent has not yet been fully liberated, although they were working on this when the uprising started. And the state in Syria still conserves a certain degree of control over land and subsidized agriculture. So the poor are likely to make more money than the rich because the land is not yet totally and completely in the hands of the rich, as it has moved in Egypt. And we will talk again about that. In summary, the rural Arabs are poor and marginalized. Extreme food insecurity is essential in the rural areas. Is essentially in the rural areas. As one of the UNDP analysts recently wrote, Muhammad Pornik, all economic reform programs in the Arab world should give priority to agricultural and rural development, while the economic contribution of rural areas is still significant, as seen in this chart. It is significant, as you can see. It's about, Egypt. It's about 15%. Okay, it's about 15% of the GDP. In Syria, it's about 30%, 20% of the GDP. So that's really very, very significant. But this significance is grossly unrecognized. The share of the agricultural budget, the expenditure in the Arab world, is only 2.4% of the national budget goes to where 50% of the people live. Okay, so I mean, I'm not surprised they're angry. For Egypt, it's just 3%, down from 5% in '95 of the global budget. For Tunisia, it's 6%. Even for Syria, when we talk a lot about Syrian subsidy and support of agriculture, it's just 5.6%. Agriculture is just less than 20% of the Yemeni GDP, and yet the Yemeni state spends just 1% of their income. It's an oil-producing country on agriculture. But do you know, Lebanon, it's less than 1%, by the way, just so that you know. Okay, so these policies are essentially and effectively de-development policies. They cannot be perceived or conceived in any other way. Now, access to land entitlements, so we talk a little bit about entitlements here, remains one of the most challenging hurdles facing Arab small farmers, who are the backbone of the local food system. In many Arab countries, the fertile land endowment is limited by natural conditions, a mixture of terrain and water availability. In Egypt, for instance, the farmland area per capita is just 1/25 of a hectare. It's one of the smallest in the world. Those in power hold much of this land, directly or indirectly. The Gini index, shown here for land and income and dietary energy consumption. That's a really interesting chart, by the way. The Gini index is an index of the distribution, of inequality in distribution. The closer you are to 100, the more unequal distribution. 100 is when one person owns everything and then everyone else owns nothing. The Arab, so I can't really, but I'm sure Libya has been enough in the news for you to be able to find it on the upper map in here. So when you see Libya in here with the barrel, that is not, by the way, an explanation for NATO's interference in Libya. The barrel is here to say that it actually sells oil. And here, you see that Libya is actually theoretically food secure because it produces a lot of oil, it sells it. But if you look at Libya, at the level of micro-food security, which is the dietary insufficiency in children, then you'll find that this does not translate into here, hence the role of policies. Now, you can reverse that, of course. If you look at Jordan in here, it's a little red dot, just next to Lebanon, which is non-existent in here. I mean, it is. It's a red dot too, by the way. And you'll find that Jordan, okay, in that particular place, is in the red when it comes to macro food security. However, when you look at the micro food security, which is effectively what the people feel, that's what they sense, you find that it's actually doing pretty well in this chart, which is an IFPRI chart, so I have to believe it. And so in this IFPRI chart, Jordan is actually doing well, which means that in order to be able to provide food security for your people, you don't really need to be able to export a lot of stuff and to have a balance of trade. You can take adequate policies, but as was the case in Jordan, these policies have a time limit, and this time limit is market-based. You can't choose to be in the market when you want and out of the market when you don't want. So when you let the market decide, then when the market doesn't have, there is a bigger buyer, you have to be prepared for stuff to change. And this is what happened in Jordan, of course. In 2008, there were riots, called food riots. They were, you know, now people are moving because of the prices of food and stuff like that. So that's what we need to say about that. Now, there is another approach, of course, and I want to talk about it briefly in here because it forms the basis of a policy that we might want to look into later. Food sovereignty is the right of people to define their own food and agriculture. And this is a radical departure from the conventional approach to food security. This approach is critical of government subsidies to multinational corporations, acknowledges destructions of farming systems, and the conglomeration of corporate power. Rather than intensive agricultural production, this approach advocates agroecology for the long-term care of environmental resources, as well as the strengthening of smallholder farms to combat the depeasantization that leads to the proliferation of urban slums and to rising poverty level. Those of you who follow, by the way, the Occupy movement, and then will know, and I learned about it thanks to Marcy, that there has been recently an Occupy the Farms movement taking place in California, near Berkeley, you know, where things start usually. And I think that's a really interesting, you know, movement. And you know, they went out and they occupied, they turned into a communal farm land that belongs to the university, you know. So I mean, I can't say more than that, and no analogy is intended or meant in here with any place that is resembling remotely to the place where I work. And the interest in building a food sovereignty network, by the way, is growing in the Arab world. And there's a campaign that began with the Arab Group for the Protection of Nature. And interestingly, the Arab Organization for Agricultural Development defines food security in terms that are closer to food sovereignty. You know, that's really interesting. Let me just read this to you. It's my translation. And you need to know that the AOAD is kind of part of the the League of Arab States. And also here, I'm not, you know, I'm really not a supporter here, but that definition somehow escaped, probably because nobody really cares what the people who work in agriculture have to say about policy and stuff like that. So it says the provision food security for the Arab world, as recognized by the Arab Organization, is the provision of food in quantity and quality required for activity and health sustainably to all citizens of the Arab nation, through reliance on local production first, and on the comparative advantages for production across the Arab nation, and making it available to Arab citizens at prices that are consistent with their income levels and material conditions. You can start a revolution with that thing, by the way. I wish the Arab League would actually read this again. The results of the neoliberal agricultural policies and the incorporation of Arab countries in the global food regimes are manifested through chronic changes in diets in the region. Malnutrition is embodied by what we call the double burden of chronic undernourishment and obesity. Both of them happen, by the way, with the poor. Between 5 and 15% of Arab children are considered underweight, but also almost half of pregnant Egyptian women are anemic, a sign of valuable nutrient deficiency. At the same time, 30% of Egyptian adults are obese. And obesity estimates for other Arab countries Jordan, Kuwait, and the UAE are higher at 35 or even 45. The concept of nutritional transitions addresses the change in diet associated with rural to urban migration, as well as the connections between obesity and poverty. One of the reasons for the nutritional transition is the cheap and accessible calories from processed foods, especially gazous, sweetened beverages like soft drinks. These pack a huge amount of corn sugar and, fill up, and they are part of why people become obese while they're eating so poorly. I want to read a story here, just because you're starting to doze off with all my charts. So my story goes as such. In 2008, a rich Egyptian, and this is the section, that talks about how do policies come to exist. In 2008, a rich Egyptian businessman close to the Mubarak family was promised the post of Minister of Agriculture in the next government. He immediately recruited a major international consultancy company and instructed it to develop a new agricultural strategy policy for Egypt. And here I have for full disclosure, I have to say that for a very, very brief moment, I was part of the team that actually worked on that. I'm not sure that's perfectly legal, but it's okay. All costs were borne by the ministerial hopeful personally. The approach was, as expected, fully market-oriented, following the core principles of neoliberal economics. Nowhere did the inequalities in land distribution, the continued external markets, as well as the absurdity of exporting food when it is needed at home, appear in that new policy. By the way, but at the same time, as the team was professionally and working on this policy, the team started looking for what information was available. They found out that an international UN organization was actually developing a similar policy mandated by the current ministry. So there were two policies being developed at the same time for an agricultural policy of Egypt. And both these policies, but more so the one that came, with kind of the private consultancy, focused a lot on export. Now, perishable, high-value farm products such as organic herbs and strawberries destined for export are always to be encouraged, even though a plethora of reports indicate that small farmers are incapable of benefiting from this type of agriculture. Another unsettling finding that emerged in here when outside this context, was that international aid organizations were also involved in promoting luxury farming for the delicate palates of the northern consumers. So you get this aid that we're always told, we're giving you aid in Egypt, you know what you do with it, and in fact, it's actually to produce food that is not consumed locally. Similar stories can be found with slight variations in every country of the Arab world. I've worked long enough in Lebanon to know that that also is the case, and it essentially illustrates the approach to agriculture and to the policy-making process. In this perspective, following this perspective, this approach, agriculture is a capital investment sector in which agrarian people are incidental and often bothersome. How can we get rid of them? Now I'm like, down to about 2/3 of my talk, so can take a deep breath, and I'm going to move into some kind of local cuisine. Tagine is the first one. I want to talk a little bit about Tunisia in here, and it's impossible to cover everything, but just to start about how things have become the way they are. When French colonialism grabbed Tunisia in the 19th century, its main aim, believe it or not, was to exploit Tunisia's land to produce wheat for France's consumption. To achieve this, the French established education and research centers, the most important of which was the École coloniale d'agriculture de Tunis, the colonial agriculture school of Tunis, whose name reflects its mission. This center specialized in training agricultural engineers and local people to develop agricultural productions and to improve the yield of grains. agricultural research neglected smallholders. The Tunisians will agree on that. Their only choice, the smallholders, was to join the agri-commercial sectors, which they were never qualified to succeed in. As a result, they lost their food security and became dependent on subsidized imported wheat from France and other ex-colonial countries. Migration into the cities finally led into migration onto the streets, setting the sparks of the revolution, as in Sidi Bouzid. Sidi Bouzid, incidentally, was well known for its dairy production and other high-quality agricultural products. This contribution to food security and to the economy of Tunisia was never valued by the state, and local people were never able to make a living, and that is essentially what drove a lot of people into the street. Now, in Egypt, things look a little bit different. The agrarian roots of Egypt's uprising lay in one of Mubarak's most infamous pieces of economic legislation, Law 96 of 1992. The law liberated, not in the same way as Sina was liberated, but liberated land rents, that is, they become open into the market, which had been held at levels that smallholder farmers can afford. It is now estimated that between 1 and 4 million small farmers have stopped farming across Egypt in the last 20 years since the enactment of Law 96. At the same time of the law, tenant farmers and their families composed about 10% of the Egyptian population. As Ray Bush has documented, there were many examples of organized resistance to neoliberal policies in Egypt. There were farmers and leftist protests against Law 96 in Cairo and Dakhliya. In the aftermath of the act, land rent rose in some places by 400%. And in others, the cost to purchase agricultural land grew 5 times over a decade, benefiting the landowning class. To paraphrase Saskia Sassan, land in Egypt became more valuable than the lives of its food producers. Despite this strategic de-development of agrarian livelihoods, agriculture still composes 15% of the Egyptian GDP and accounts for 36% of overall employment. Over half of Egypt's 80 million people live in rural areas, and that number is increasing. The absence of government support has pushed Egyptian farmers into high levels of indebtedness. Often farmers are in debt to the same bank that engages in selling fertilizers on the black market to encourage reports of scarcity and increased prices. As the rural population grows in Egypt, they will face a myriad of challenges and structural inequality if the agrarian struggle for food sovereignty is not addressed. Egypt imports most of the staple it consumes. By the way, Egypt is the world's largest importer of wheat. 80% of the corn that is consumed is imported. But more importantly, 90% of the cooking oil and 50% of the wheat, flour and beans, 33% of the sugar, and that is here the biggest one, 98% of the lentils. I mean, what do the Egyptians eat? What's the main dish? Sure. What is based on lentils? Kushari. All of kushari, the essential food that people eat, is actually made from imported stuff. These foodstuffs compose the diet of the majority of Egyptians, except for the upper middle class and the oligarchy. The possibilities to expand agricultural lands are limited in Egypt, and so is the water. And there are no clear predictions of what will happen to the Nile water if global precipitations continue to decrease. Ethiopia is also pressuring Egypt for a share of the Nile. Egypt is currently using 75% of the Nile's water under an agreement in place since 1929. And Burundi has just joined the signatories of a group asking and demanding a re-evaluation of that Nile Treaty. So big issues happening in here. Now, Syria, and could you please switch that off? No, joking, just keep it. The adoption of structural adjustment policies in Syria has been slower than countries like Egypt and Tunisia. The Ba'ath Party coup in Syria in '63 reformed the agricultural economy with strong support from the Syrian peasant and agrarian classes. Previously, land-owning merchant elites had monopolized state resources. The coup centralized state power, and the Ba'ath Party instituted nationalization policies for the banking sectors, as well as redistributing a third of agricultural land. Hafiz al-Assad installed himself as a president in 1970 and immediately reversed the more radical policies, like the land redistribution plans. Referred to this time as the infitah of abundance, the opening of abundance. Bashar al-Assad came to power in Syria in 2000, inheriting the dictatorship from his father. Under Bashar, the neoliberal process accelerated. Legislation deregulated the real estate market and put in place private property protections, which led farmers to face increasing land rents and increasing prices for agricultural inputs. In Syria, around 9 million people live in rural areas. Agriculture is the main activity in these areas, employing 55% of the labor force. The sector accounted for more than a quarter of GDP and total employment for more than a quarter of total employment in 2004. Neoliberal policies have endangered this population. Bashar al-Assad's policies have worsened standards of living in Syria. Unemployment is greater than 30%, and poverty level estimates are between 11 and 30%, according to, of course, to authors who've been looking at that. Let me just say something here, that's not in my talk. I don't know how many of you realize that there's been a drought going on. This year was exceptional in Lebanon, but like 5 years drought in Syria. A lot of small ruminant production in Syria because it's a region in which there is still a badia, which is where the Bedouin live, and there is still, to a certain extent, some mobile pastoralism. And in 2008, 2009, some sheep herder, major in Bedouin sheep, actually committed suicide, killed themselves because they couldn't see their flock being decimated by lack of, because the price of corn increased on the global market for a multitude of reasons, oil, biofuel, plenty of stuff was happening at that time and continued to increase. So people lost, hundreds of thousands of heads of sheep, which is essentially their livestock, and some of them actually shot themselves, committed suicide. Of course, it's nothing compared to what goes on with small farmers in India, and I urge you to actually have a look at what goes on when neoliberal policies pressure small farmers in India. I think the figure is about 100 small Indian farmers commit suicide every day for the past 5 years. Am I right, Marcy? You're clued up on this. You don't know? Why are you here? So now, but I mean, the figure is like that. It's daunting. It's like over 1 million people. Okay? Now, the products. I love that picture. The great leader overlooking the Baklawa is like, something that, protecting everything, even the Baklawa. Now, the products of the Syrian agrarians, are still much in demand. Qamar al-Din here is an example. And this used to be made, by the way, from the local Klebi variety of sour apricot that were used to be grown almost exclusively in the Damascus Ghouta, in the Ghouta of Damascus. Now today it's manufactured from fruits harvested from modern high-yielding varieties grown in any location in Syria or elsewhere, and it's made sweeter with imported corn syrup. Okay? Now the product no longer reflects food culture or even benefits agrarian livelihood, because it's those who own these huge apricot farms that can maximize their benefit from that. So that, this has been transformed into a commodity. This little piece in here is the traditional variety, and the bigger one there, deeply orange because of some manipulations or whatever, is one of the new varieties and I want to, before I move, remind you to pay respect to our great leadership. Okay, now the question is, of course, where are we going here? You know, what's happening? What's cooking for us? I mean, we know exactly why things are. I mean, at least we know what some of the huge driving forces. Don't forget, I mean, these rurals, these agrarians, they're 50% of the people of the Arab world. So they're likely to be, they're among the poorest. So they're likely to be more than 50% of those who protested. All right, you know, because I mean, I'm sure the Twitter generation was there. You know, AUC has a big representation in Tahrir, but I mean, the bulk of the millions, trust me, believe me, we're not your blogger and your Twitter and your Facebooker. Okay, there are people who actually were looking to change their lives. Who captures the limelight is a different issue. Now, the media reports indicate that in Tunisia, the feeling is that there is no real change in the countryside where the uprising began. This is despite the fact that the agriculture sector provides 11% of the Tunisian GDP and continues to attract foreign investment. Statistics also show, you know, data that we have, that agriculture exports rose by 12% after the revolution, but didn't benefit any of the small farmers. Tunisian farmers are demanding renewed investment in small-scale agriculture and in conservation agriculture practices that improve yield. However, they need investment from the state for those efforts to be successful. Islamist parties in Egypt and Tunisia have won substantial victories in recent elections. Both the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Nahda in Tunisia have taken great pains to assure the US and Europe that they will continue to embrace free market capitalism. Khairat Shatir, the director of the Muslim Brotherhood's economic platform, has met with the IMF in order to sign Egypt up for a new $3.2 billion loan. As Fawaz Gergis wrote, in Egypt and Tunisia, they want to send a clear message: Islam is good for business. In the meantime, the future of agrarians of Egypt is unclear. The Egypt Military Council opened new chemical factories in Fayoum after the removal of Mubarak. Farmers have linked pollution from these factories to the deterioration of the olive and palm tree, the major exports from the 15,000 feddans of agricultural land in that area. However, a popular movement has recently emerged in the countryside where 18 million farmers live. Farmers are organizing independent unions in Egypt, built on a 30-year-old movement that is seeing success and, you know, serious and sustained and potentially extremely important success for the first time in 30 years. Outside of the military council, the Muslim Brotherhood is in the party of the party in the strongest political position to change Egypt's economy. While the Muslim Brotherhood have said that they will not alter any of the current economic policies, they are also the party with the strongest ties to rural areas. That needs to be noted as well. This marks a contradiction in their rhetoric of social justice and their neoliberal economic policies, a contradiction that was very ably pointed by Adam Haniyeh. The Muslim Brotherhood and other similar parties receive a great deal of their funding from the GCC countries, leading many to speculate that they are advancing a GCC in cooperation with the US economic agenda. This agenda includes a pliant regime in Egypt that maintains an active US presence in the region and neighboring Palestine. In a recent article, Yasmin Mu'taz Ahmed explained the support for the Muslim Brotherhood's rival party, An-Nur, in rural areas. Many people in villages in Al-Fayoum she spoke to referred to the An-Nur party as more religiously flexible than the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is also known in the area for their support of Law 92. Remember that law that I told you about? While the Salafi politicians, An-Nur, actually filed complaints with the parliament on behalf of some of these farmers. Mu'taz Ahmed's research indicates a class relationship between the political parties vying for power after the fall of Mubarak. I ask, you know, where should the agrarians go in here? I mean, no, clearly nobody wants them, but they're still 50%. I mean, I don't mind turning this whole place into a, you know, a plastic factory, but people have still to tell me, what do I do with 150 million Arabs? What? Nobody has an answer to that. It's clear that the marginalization of rural areas call for immediate attention. Authoritarian regimes have destroyed the social fabric. The free market has not functioned equitably, and it never does. Rather, it is skewed through political connections towards favoring influential elites. To stem the tide of de-development, a new Arab integration is called for. All revenues can be invested in farmers from Sudan and Syria, rather than be diverted to foreign investments like ports in the US, for example. Now, I cannot help go back for a second to the issue of food security and sovereignty. What I didn't say when I showed you the pictures, the figures for the investment in agriculture, is that most of the state investment, several tens of %, is in investment in arms and weapons that are also imported, usually Europe or the United States. And they make for huge deals in these arms. But why do we have weapons? Isn't it for security? Isn't it to maintain state sovereignty? So the argument here, can't the argument be made that sovereignty and security is better served by diverting a fraction of that investment into the livelihoods of the rural people? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Rami Zurayk. We have about half an hour for questions. I think what we'll do is let's go ahead and take a couple and then have Rami come back and we'll take another couple. Go ahead over here. Yes, go ahead.
Dr. Zurayk, I liked very much your presentation, and I would like to buy the book. Where I can buy it? Here in the bookstore?
On bookstore.
Yes, okay. In any way,
he has read it.
In any way, there is one point on which I want to ask you. You failed to mention about the agrarian reform which was undertaken by Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and South Yemen in the late 50s, and by which it was a policy, government policy in these 4 countries to distribute land and to reduce the inequality between the feudal owners of the farms. In this way, what they have done, they have distributed land, and there was less inequality than before. But they have not solved the problem of agriculture, unless, and here is the point that you agree with me, that the major point, the major problem of the Arab world in agriculture and agrarian reform is how to bring new technologies at the level of the farm. And here we have to invest more in research and in extension. And the second problem is related to agriculture credit. And the major problem is how to invest more in the rural areas, because the major problem to me is unemployment in the rural areas. Take a country like Morocco. In Morocco, I have been the FAO, I was the FAO representative in Morocco for 3 years, and I have felt this locally. I'm very close to the problem. Unemployment in the rural areas imply that we have to invest not only in agriculture, but also in non-agricultural activities. Thank you.
Maybe you want to answer that, or do you want?
I'll take another couple of questions.
Marcy, please, back here.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the food security issue, but also in relation to U.S. aid in particular, and Kissinger's idea of control the food, you control the people, and this notion that the Arab uprisings don't have a foreign policy agenda, how food plays a role in that.
I'll take one more and then...
You mentioned that the rural population was declining, and whereas the absolute population was increasing. Did you mean within the rural areas, or did you mean just on the thing.
I can answer that quickly. In terms of percent, it's decreasing, but in terms of absolute numbers, it's increasing because of the increase in population across the countries.
Okay, and the other question really is that if the issue of land itself, can market forces in any way enable the production of sufficient quantities of food and other agricultural processes without a social and a cultural transformation within the rural setup?
Okay, I can answer first, Minister Cortaz. Thanks for your question. Of course, agriculture reform or land is only part of the entitlements that people have. If you have land without water, there isn't much you can do with. If you don't have access to techniques and technology, I'm not one of those. I'm really keen on local food culture, maintaining, because I think it's really good for people. It's good for the country. It's put, countries that lose their cultures kind of become dissociated, but all of this requires a very, very strong scientific base. Really strong, but science doesn't always mean genetic manipulation, and it can actually, there is pretty good science underlying the whole agroecology movement, and it's pretty good. And we know from data, from research, that the yields, the productivity, the long-term productivity is equal, if not better, than those that you find on. I mean, there is a wealth of data on this issue, but we don't do research on that. Why? Because you need to ask yourself, who funds the research? Who pays the research money? So when your research money in the big research institutions comes from Monsanto, for example, or from any other seed company, or from Cargill, then your research agenda has to go in that direction. Now, we don't have this problem in Lebanon, of course, because there is no money for agricultural research. So it's actually, we don't have this dilemma about doing that. In this country here, most of the research, and you know that because you work here, happens at the hand of private company. They have their own private research centers in which they do seed and fertilizer trials, and they bring the farmers and they show them what you can do if you indebt yourself and buy a lot of this pesticide and a lot of this fertilizer and install this or that. And as you see, your cucumber is going to be huge with that. So land alone is not sufficient. Land reforms that have happened, I mean, it's really long debate, and in fact what happened to them in every country has been different in the past they have taken. In Syria, for example, Hafiz al-Assad blocked them at one point, but also we need to know that these immediately after these immediate post-colonial regimes, I mean, did not do a fair and equitable distribution of land. But there were a lot of cronism even in the distribution of land, be it community cronism in regions, in area, people who have helped versus people who were not part, people who are part of the clique, even if it is not a capitalist, oligarch clique. I mean, people got land that they did not really use. And then there was also a time, and because you were in the FAO, when the notion of agriculture was like a very industrialized notion of agriculture. Plow it deep, increase the hybrid seed production, put a lot of fertilizers on them. I am personally, I am not a person who is against the use of fertilizer. I mean, I'm a soil scientist. I know exactly when one has to use fertilizer and which fertilizer and how. And I know that there are lands that are so poor, that have been impoverished for so long, that without a little bit of, chemical addition, it's a bit like when we take a pill or anything like that. But it's one thing to be an addict to any kind of feel-good medication, and it's another thing to be able to use it in a very, in a very specific way in order to deal with a specific problem. As you've put, extension remains a huge problem. Credit is not my problem as much as, by the way, as the state. The state taking responsibility of agricultural extension. I think credit can always be found. You know why? Because banks want to lend money. That's what they do for a living. So once you start producing, banks will always be there. Yeah, they do for agriculture here, but there's the farmers. I work on this all the time. I mean, I know, and you do as well. But the problem is not there. The problem is that in credit, in credit, you have to show a ledger, that actually shows that you're going to be producing. You know how farmers work. Like, they don't produce anything, they lose for 3 years, and then they make a lot of money for 1 year, and they live on it for the next 3 years. It's really terrible. It's not a nice life. Okay, we don't want to be farmers by romanticism. We need to be farmers because we need to produce food and to maintain land and to maintain landscape. But honestly, these are the people who should receive the highest amount of subsidy from the state and of support from the state. And they are the people who receive the least. Go to a good hospital, go to a good school, go to anywhere, go around all of these rural areas in Lebanon, this nice, beautiful, great country, civilized, Switzerland of the Middle East. Go try to send a kid to a school in Hermel, for example. Who's going to become a farmer in that area? Even if land is given for free. Now, Marcy, the issue of food security, it's, I don't want to go all the way in declaring that food security is always a tool for control. But this whole idea that we have about food security, this gazouz and croissant, that if you have enough calories and even if those calories are adequate, appropriate, whatever, this whole definition eventually always boils down to access to enough calories. And it is not that really bothers me. It is, where do these come from? My essential problem with all of this, it's not that the Arab world can produce all the food it eats. It's not about autarky. It's not about trying to create a system that's self-sufficient. That doesn't work. That's silly. That's the dumb ideas. There is markets everywhere. You're going to work in the real world. This is the world in here. But it is that the potential of the Arab world in food production is far from being reached, far from being tapped. And there are clear reasons for that. One of them is that we have internalized the Sykes-Picot Agreement, like fully. It's become part of our life. People don't remember that this agreement did not exist less than 100 years ago. But there were Arab countries that interacted and dealt with each other. And that, you could actually, and I know I'm not trying to sell you again some antiquated idea of Arab nationalism, etc. That's not at all. And not unless you think that United States is an antiquated idea of state getting together, or of Europe is an antiquated idea of people finding mutual benefits in opening up. That's exactly what I'm talking about in here. So these investments need to be made in the region in here. Now, we talk a lot about, I don't think there is a grand conspiracy only. There is a grand conspiracy, but there is also people who want to make money and to become pawns and tools in a game that can control. There is no doubt that if you control the food that is produced and the trade in food, then you can actually control who goes into the street on bread riots. There is no doubt about that. The relationship is actually clear. But if the uprisings have shown something to us, they have shown that this is not enough. That we are not just empty bellies waiting to be fed and want to be fed, and that's the only thing that makes us. The uprisings made us all move from very complicated and sometimes very different, for very different agendas. And of course, the foreign agenda is extremely important in this. I mean, anybody who even Thomas Friedman is today willing to concede after having, he's willing to concede to anything, Thomas Friedman, given the right amount of time. But he's willing to concede. They've stopped selling gas to Israel. And the pipeline was bombed, 12 times in the past year? How can you talk about no foreign policy? That's not the only agenda, but that agenda is very much present. Food is, of course, another agenda in that. And food sovereignty should become an agenda. Our essential problem is that we haven't yet been able to formulate it in a way that is, and pardon the pun, palatable to people who are involved in that kind of work. Okay, that's essentially our problem. People who work in food sovereignty. I don't think it is possible to establish a fair, just society while market forces are essentially capitalist market forces. But there are non-capitalist markets, and these exist, and they can be regulated. And this is what in my opinion, we should be seeking as activists and militants and people who want to change the world, not only in the in the vicinity of Beirut, but also on a much bigger platform, because it is only this big systemic change that can actually make significant changes in the regions in which we live.
Thanks. I hope this question isn't too broad. You talked a lot about many other countries in the Arab world, but I was wondering if you could characterize the situation here in Lebanon a little bit. You said that less than 1% of GDP is spent on agricultural investment. Just could you talk about who's in control here, who's running the show? What characterizes the Lebanese agrarian economy?
Sure. I didn't talk about Lebanon, not only because there is no uprising in Lebanon, not only because there won't be any uprising in Lebanon, but also because at the level of agriculture and food production, Lebanon is a tiny little place, you know, and also the GDP share is probably the lowest in the whole of the region. And the number of rural people who actually live from agriculture is dismal. It's like about 150,000 people who are farmers, part-time or full-time farmers, and among those, only about 6 or 7% are actually full-time farmers. So while we, you know, I farm here, you know, so and I probably count among these 150,000, and I like it very, very much. I don't think it is very useful to talk about a Lebanese agriculture, you know, or as Asad would put it, a Lebanese agriculture, and in that respect. And what I would really like to see is Lebanon being a country that uses comparative advantage not for exporting abroad, but using it for producing in concertation and in coordination and in collaboration, rather than fighting with countries that are surrounding. That said, okay, the situation is not very good in here. Also, the 1998 census showed that I think about 50% of the land in Lebanon is owned by less than 10% of the farmers. And the other 50%, the other 90% have to share among them the 50%. You know, and I would say again, coming from a landless peasant family, you know, I think, you know, that's the major reason for me for why I'm always pissed off at this thing. Why don't I have land? Because I would have loved to be able to farm more and to produce more and to sell more in here. The nutritional transition has kicked in very strongly in here, more than, say, in Syria, for example, for many, many, many reasons. Let me give you an anecdote about Lebanon. Do you want an anecdote about Lebanon? Okay. Okay. Do you remember, those of you who have been here long enough will remember these very sad and shameful days when the Lebanese people used to say, we can buy and corrupt any Syrian soldier with one bag of bread. Does anyone remember that? Or are you just too young for this thing? Okay, well, the bottom line, you know, of the story was the following: that Syria did not allow the import of wheat and only made bread from their local wheat, a wheat that is milled. That's the same wheat, you know, that used to grow here a long time ago, milled, and gives a beautiful, slightly brownish, thick bread that today you pay 5 times the price for it if you buy it from Aziz, for example. Okay, so that bread used to be the Syrian bread. It used to be really good, slightly subsidized, but brown. The Lebanese had this elastic, really thin, you know, you can like read through it. You can use it as a calc paper if you're an architect. That bread, that is, for me, palatable. It has, of the bread, only the name. I don't eat that stuff. You know, you take it, it's thin, it's chewy, it's, you know, but because of, you know, white versus brown, and, you know, don't go far seeking the racist dimensions in this, about the class dimensions, the Lebanese and the Syrian, like everybody wanted to eat this white Lebanese bread that was essentially made from imported wheat. So the Lebanese were extremely happy about the fact that they could not grow one spike of wheat to make bread, but that they could use any imported stuff in order to corrupt the people around you. And of course, things changed with time, and today the Lebanese are trying to buy more brown bread that looks more like the Syrian, but they only buy it if it costs 10 times more than it used to cost back there. The second anecdote in there has to do with what we eat in Lebanon. And then I'll shut up because I have too many of these. You know, I mean, the major food in here is the manouchi, right? Like everybody loves the manouchi. You wake up in the morning, you smell manouchi. I want a manouchi. Rich, poor, everybody eats a manouchi. Workers eat a manouchi. This is the greatest thing in the world, is the manouchi. Well, I mean, think about it, okay? Less than 1% of the manouchi by weight is made in Lebanon. This fantastic Lebanese food that everybody wants to eat, you know, the real peasant food in all the villages, is made from imported flour, imported soy oil. That's a byproduct of the soil cake production industry that feeds the animals, the cows essentially. It's made from sesame that's usually imported from Sudan because we don't grow enough of it, and just a little tiny little sprinkle of thyme, you know, a little that's used in there. That's less than 1% of the weight of the most famous Lebanese food in there. And that's, I think, to my mind, really represents very much the state of the relationship between agriculture and food in our beautiful country. Manouchi. Of course I do. Do I have a choice? The market kills me, man. It's here. It's here. It's holding me by the throat. But when I can, I don't, by the way. And that's definitely, make it, you know, from scratch is certainly a million times better than that.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you very much, Rami, today for joining us. And if anybody wants to pass around a video of this talk, it'll be on our website within a week. So, thanks.